Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this inaugural episode of the Unofficial Seminar. I am here joined by my friend, Professor Dr. Amit Ranjan. Amit is a professor from NCERT. Amit, how have you been? What's happening?
Hello, Professor Chatterjee. Long time no see. I've been
Right.
good. Hope you've been good too. Um,
Right. So today we are going to discuss something quite close to our hearts, and that is this very uncanny short story by Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain, and that is called Sultana's Dream. So, Amit, you have tall claims about Sultana's Dream, and well, so do I. We've been discussing a very uncanny examples of literature and cultural specimens for as long as I can remember. And Sultana's Dream by Rokeya Hossain happens to be just one of them. But what an interesting example we have on our hands, Amit, written in 1905, 10 years before Charlotte Gilman publishes her work Herland, which is a novel. So that was published in 1915, whereas Sultana's Dream, a short story, gets published in
1905.
1905, and it remains more or less in
We,
obscurity
we
until
must also
maybe
tell our viewers that the work is in English, it's not translated. So, anybody who might think it's a translated work.
precisely the point. And this is one of the elementary mistakes people make, because one of the critical characters in the story is Sister Clara. And, given the complexity of Indian milieus, one very often thinks, is it really sister? Is it Appa? Is it a translation of Didi, Bone, etc., etc.? So it's not. It's a story, as you've rightly said, written in the English language when Rokeya was, I think, hardly 25. So, Amit, you and I have, discussed at length many uncanny specimens of the long 19th century and its impact on India. So, your own doctoral dissertation on John Lang, your first book of prose, that is, first non-fiction book. You're also guilty of being a poet, which
That's
is
a
a chapter.
verdict, as Leonard Cohen says, that's a verdict for the reader, not for the writer to claim.
Right. So,
Be a
in your other business, your non-fiction book was on John Lang, and you are also bringing out a book on Dara Shikoh. And
Exactly.
in the lives of both these people, the 19th century had a huge role to play. So with Rokeya Hossain, I suppose. Now, any initial thoughts on the story? When did you encounter Sultana's Dream first, and what did it make you think of about Indian history or the 19th century?
I don't know when I encountered it first. Probably in undergraduate days, accidentally somewhere. And my first thoughts were, oh my God, why is this not in school curriculum, or why do we not know it?
Hmm.
And That's a pity how, geopolitics and political boundaries affect boundaries of literature as well.
Hmm.
Rokeya Khatun is as Indian as it gets,
Hmm.
but she's very well known in Bangladesh
Hmm.
because she's from East Bengal, as is the
Hmm.
case with Qazi Nazrul Islam, who's from
Hmm.
West Bengal, Asansol, but still
Hmm.
not widely known beyond Bengal. Um, he got the citizenship of Bangladesh on his deathbed in the
Hmm.
1970s and is the national poet of Bangladesh. He was Indian all his life. So
Hmm.
these are things to ponder about, how politics also shapes the literary the politics of literary history.
Hmm.
But anyway, talking just of this story, first time I encountered it, it was mind blowing,
Hmm.
because there's a whole history of the first thing that was mind blowing was the word utopia, when one
Hmm.
learned that utopia actually means a society which is completely male and excludes women, starting with New Atlantis in 1666. That's where
Hmm.
the tradition starts. And all subsequent male writers write about such utopias
Hmm.
till Mary Shelley puts a break to it, probably 1819 was it? Wife of Percy Shelley, and daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and daughter of Thomas More. Right? And Thomas More wrote a utopia on the lines of New Atlantis. So this was writing back to the father in a way. So Frankenstein is seen for many things, but the most important thing I see it for is that an artificially produced human being out of body parts of waste by a man, and there's no woman involved over there. Um,
Mm.
what kind of a society does it lead to? Um,
Mhm.
and even though it's a baby created out of this artificial technology,
Mhm.
he's hated, he's treated like a monster. So it's an insinuation of at what male psychology would be if it would be completely male world. So Mary Shelley was is profound with Frankenstein, and almost 100 years later, in 1905, we have Rokeya Khatun, who's um, goes further in the realm of science fiction and assertion of women's utopia with Sultana's dream, where men are have voluntarily imprisoned themselves because they can no longer deal with the stress of the world. And um, the women of Rokeya Khatun are so amazing because there are new ideas, like not fighting with guns and swords, but fighting with sun's rays, deflecting sun's rays onto the enemy, which also
Mm.
means the ethical practices of fighting only during the day, which is
Mm.
lost by the early 20th century. And so on. The women fight and they cook, they bring up babies. The men's purpose is only probably procreation. And also, the most amazing, I think, the punchline in Sultana's dream is that women work only 2 hours instead of men's eight, because men smoke and gossip the remaining 6 hours. That's a profound
Yeah.
statement. I think it holds
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. Mary Shelley's father, William Godwin, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, were known
Yeah,
as
William Godwin. Sorry, I said Thomas More. William Godwin. Yeah.
William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft were both they were known for their very egalitarian principles and their vindication of the rights of women as early as the 18th century. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, clearly there's a clear genealogical link between Frankenstein and Sultana's Dream. Now, guilty as you and I are, Amit, of trying to find these traces of what may have inspired literary authors or fiction authors to historical correlates or other correlates in other kinds of literature, Frankenstein being one. I was recently telling my students that there's also some good deal of impact of Gulliver's Travels, particularly the caricature of the Royal Society. It's not caricatured in Sultana's Dream. It's taken very seriously, but the reflectors, the sunbeam reflectors, and the solar energy harnesses, I think they were predated by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels,
Sure,
albeit.
Swift is a genius and has tremendous impact on all the later writers in terms of imagining, and
Mm,
also during this period, how literature mirrors science. Frankenstein mirrors all the developments in electricity, and similarly, the talk of solar power, the talk of
mm,
airplanes. Also, in
mm,
Sultana's dream, there are no roads; there are only gardens, and there are these
mm,
solar-powered helicopters flying around. So.
mm,
So also the relation between women and science, how men view as science as exploitative of Earth. New Atlantis says that now we have conquered, now we'll drill. Of course, it's a deep sexual innuendo in New
mm,
Atlantis as well, and that's how the Earth gets branded as female in Western canon from this time, 17th century, and
mm,
how women view science very differently.
mm. Yeah, and I was also discussing recently, and this very fascinating part of 19th century history interests me greatly, particularly the branch of Indian history which has been somewhat censored, spearheaded by Annie Besant and prior to her Helena Blavatsky. So how do you characterize somebody like Helena Blavatsky? Is she a science enthusiast, or is she completely anti science? Is she a philistine? I would say she's the former. I mean, she talks to ghosts and everything. I think that's the more subversive and deliberately transgressive element in her, perhaps. But she takes science extremely seriously, except she does not seem to think of it as an exploitative, force like Darwin would have. For Darwin, science is, it's almost a biblical code without the Bible,
True,
whereas Helena Blavatsky is far more
which is
interested in.
why whatever is called social Darwinism, in which the missionaries aligned with Darwin so seamlessly. Though initially
Mm,
it seemed like the mission would be at loggerheads with Darwin,
mm,
gradually they merged into one, and which is why Darwinists now say social Darwinism is different from scientific Darwinism. But talking of Blavatsky, Annie Besant et al., 19, we also have to understand that science keeps changing its definitions. So, in 19th
precisely.
century, phrenology was a big discipline. It was
Mm,
considered as important as telegraph in the 1850s.
mm,
So, for viewers, phrenology is the study of skull.
mhm,
And if the skin is removed, it's better. The skull can be studied better. So, like the lines on the palm reveal your fate. Similarly,
mhm,
it was believed that the cerebrum gets mapped onto the inner skull, which affects
mm.
the outer skull. So, if you study the outer skull, you will be able to figure out. And so, criminality, genius, etc. It was very big, and so was what you were saying, talking with ghosts. The term was spiritualism. So John Lang talks about both these things quite a lot in his newspaper, the Mofussilite, as also the other newspapers of the time, Delhi Gazette, Hurakuru, and so on. They all talk about and mesmerism also. So spiritualism was calling these ghosts, beckoning them. So there's this Judge Andrew Thomas Turton Peterson, who is also ATTP, who is also John Lang's brother-in-law. He's written a whole book of talking to ghosts from Julius Caesar up to his time. And so science keeps changing how the world views it. And students should also understand that what seems to be science today may change its form 100 years later.
Exactly. So what we call the STEM field today, obviously we've been perpetually unhappy that it does not have a good gender ratio. It is extremely, tilted towards men, or few women seem to even today.
I'd
There's
just
a
like to intervene over here. And
paucity of
what we've
women in.
just been talking about
Yeah.
historically probably has had this impact because, like we just discussed, women viewed science very differently throughout 19th century, from Mary Shelley to Rokeya Khatun. And so, of course, the patriarchal forces controlling science and technology would not want an alternative vision. They would want a standard exploitative vision, and which is why um, probably the field was discouraged for women, and it was said that it's difficult for them to understand, and so on. And which also goes with the ideas of phrenology that women have smaller brains, or and so on.
Exactly, and this is something that Rokeya Hossain also touches on in Sultana's Dream, that women have smaller brains, but then elephants do not control the earth. It is humans who control the earth, despite having smaller brains than elephants.
Yeah.
So women might as well control the human realm. Is the message of the satirical message of Sultana's Dream. Now, I wanted to sort of test the grounds of what actually informs Sultana's Dream, other than Gulliver's Travels, Frankenstein, and any other canonical Western models of literature that Rokeya Hossain must have read. She was encouraged by her husband to read. She picked up English and Bangla through her own reading. She was not tutored in Bengali and English, as you know, and she was writing fantastically well at the age of 25, judging from Sultana's Dream. So I have hazarded, some informed speculations. I've tried to locate the trajectory of Indian writings in the 19th century, and in my book Indians in London, and of course the subsequent papers I wrote. Amit, I found that a lot of Indians were traveling to London and Europe, and writing about these spaces was becoming a kind of literature. It was becoming a kind of quasi anthropological activity. I know that's an over glamorization, but these writings did have a good deal of impact. And there was a lady, a Hindu lady, as she called herself, living in Madras, a Telugu speaker. Her name was Potham Janakumar Raghavia, and she published in 1876 what is, to my mind, the first Indian woman's travel account in English, and she writes it as Pictures of England, and I've written a paper on that too. And she calls London fairyland, and the others, the men that is, used to call London a dreamland. Now, I have sensed that there are uncanny correlations between Fairyland and Dreamland and Ladyland of Rokeya Hossain. So Ladyland is in some parts derived from London because of the obvious link that Ladyland has a sovereign who's the queen, and women feel very safe in Ladyland, exactly like they would feel in London. London was a capitalist haven. It was mesmeric, thanks to the Crystal Palace exhibition of the 1850s.
Mhm.
And Sister Clara lives in Darjeeling, so we don't exactly know whether the other character that Sultana meets in Dream is Sister Clara or her look-alike or think-alike. But the fact that she superimposes Sister Clara's image onto this other character, signifies that Sister Clara is surely not Indian. To me, that is very, very clear. Sister Clara is not Indian.
Sure.
Now, that is my informed speculation. But you were telling me before we started that you have a slightly different theory.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, let me try to counter the idea of London, given
Mhm.
that Charles Dickens um, represented so much poverty of London, a dirty city, and so with the romantic poets who take refuge in the Lake District and so on, do not like the city. So of course, the Indian visitors may have a different view of London, but the Londoners themselves, and both of these views were available in India to read.
Mhm.
So that's one. What might have influenced, one doesn't know. My
Mhm.
theory is Australian theory,
Mhm.
which is also why Rokeya Khatun was writing in English. So this is a very
Mhm.
interesting story. The girls in South Australia, and South Australia was the second penal colony after New South Wales. New South Wales is Sydney and so on. South Australia is where all the coal was found, and later uranium, Adelaide, and so on. So this became a big colony, and all the free people from England settled over there and employed all the convict labor. So it was a very labor intensive place, and the girls growing up there were wild. They were not like Victorian women. They're riding
Mhm.
horses, cowgirls, let's say. And
Mhm.
we know how Victorian England was. There's a discipline of home science, of finishing school to groom girls into becoming good sociosomatic snobbish girls, that they were supposed to faint on listening to bad news and get revived by smelling salts and so on. They had to have a perfect figure, they had to know the ball dance and so on. So finishing school was very important, and the South Australian girls were no good at any of this, so it caused a lot of anxiety to their parents. So they were sent back home. So home for Australia was London, of course, and these
Well,
girls went.
so you counter my theory by not countering my theory, which is very very unique.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so they went through Colombo and Bombay, and many of
Mhm.
these girls would run away with Indian men in India. So
Indian
at least,
by Indian men you mean British people who were
no, no,
in
no,
the Indian army.
Indian royalty, Indian princes. So, for
Okay,
example, the king
right.
of Pudukkottai, or there was King Martand in Gujarat,
Okay,
and so
very
on. So
interesting.
there are at least three Melbourne girls who became royalty in India, and that's much later, the early 20th century. But
Okay.
during 19th century, this was happening. So
Hmm.
then this became another problem, because there is mixing of the conqueror and the conquered, but it's the
Hmm.
conquering men and conquered women, not the other way around. So this was happening the other way around. So in that anxiety, they decided to make nuns out of these girls instead of letting them run away with Indian men.
Hmm.
So they opened South Australian Baptist Women Mission in Pune,
mm,
and in Bengal. So, in one of the recorded meetings of the Baptist Mission of Pune, out of 150 members who attended, an overwhelming 90% majority is women. So, these girls were not allowed to interact with Indian men, lest they run
mm,
away with them. So, they were
mm,
allowed to interact only in the Zanana,
mm,
um, the women's quarters. And so in Bengal, because the Muslim society had clearly marked zananas, they were allowed to interact in the zanana, and suddenly you see Muslim women learning English um, instead of Bengali. I mean, sure, they were proficient in Bengali as well, but they
mm.
learned English. And I think Rokeya Khatun is of that line. And the
Okay.
Sister Clara that she's alluding to
Yeah.
is is somebody from the South Australian Baptist mission that she is alluding to. And also in terms of ideas, the
Mm,
Victorian sensibility, um,
mm-hmm,
even in the most um, progressive, rebellious writers of the time, like Jane Austen, is
mm-hmm,
very muffled, is very miffed.
mm-hmm.
Um, and it's so probably it's the Australian women who had these bold ideas, and which gets translated in and of course mixed with not to take away from her own agency, of course, the Indian freedom struggle itself, which was gaining momentum, and Bengal being the hub of it, had to be
Mm-hmm.
partitioned in 1908. So it's her own ideas plus what might have been the influence of the South Australian missionaries in Bengal.
Well, I there's lots to agree there. I just was looking at the literary production of Sultana's Dream, how it was published, where it was published. But before I say more, let me tell you which are the parts that excite me, and I definitely agree with. So I think both you and I believe that Sister Clara is clearly not Indian, and she's part of some mission. My
Yeah, yeah,
initial guess she was Catholic, or she was Irish Catholic or Protestant, Presbyterian, or she was clearly based in Darjeeling, which also reminds me, Amit, there was a very robust Australian mission in Mussoorie and Dehradun, don't you
hmm,
think?
yeah,
So that was during the first quarter of, I think it began during the first quarter of the 20th century. So Mussoorie and Dehradun are also one of our sites of crime,
of course.
which we will visit someday, hopefully. So Sister Clara, somebody based in Darjeeling, I thought she was an Irish Catholic or she was Protestant. You are saying she's part of the Australian Baptist mission. Clearly, she's a missionary, and it's
Yeah,
because of that missionary influence that Rokeya Hossain, Rokeya Khatun, has acquired English language skills. Also because of her husband Sakhawat Hossain, who was a deputy magistrate. Now
yeah.
this is published in the Indian Ladies magazine in 1905, which is in Madras. And it was that that led me to think that maybe she was accessing copies of the Indian Ladies magazine. Maybe this periodical was subscribed to by her husband or folks.
Or by the
And
mission she was in touch with.
I well, these are, I think, all valid speculations. Her husband submits her story through
Hmm,
the magistrate, through his boss.
right.
And the boss then sends the story for publication to the Indian Ladies magazine. And it was that the Indian Ladies magazine connection, the Madras connection, that made me create that link between Rokeya Hussain and Potham Janakumar Raghaviya of 30
Hmm,
years ago, of
hmm,
1876.
hmm.
That does not discount the fact that there was a multi-pronged missionary presence in and around Rokeya. And what is
Yes.
true for the goose is also true for the gander. So, what is true for Australian Baptist missionary women may be equally true for Catholic women, let's say.
I
So,
disagree slightly on that because the Australian missionary women are unwilling participants in the whole thing. They are
mhm,
these wild girls who must be tamed and are somehow over there. So
mhm,
they have their wild ideas still of rebellion,
mhm.
whereas somebody coming from England or Ireland would be more cowed down, more mellow. So they wouldn't have as
Or more strategic, or far more strategic,
yeah.
and far more sharp
There is
and
a matter of strategy in this short story also,
uh-huh.
which is to frame it as a dream.
Exactly.
Just like in Sultana's story, but it's framed as a dream, and when the dream breaks, it's just let with a sigh that someday, oh no, it's a beautiful dream, and so on. It's framed as a dream, as a part of a strategy to avoid censorship, that the magazine may not reject it, saying it's outrageous and so on. So
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Sultana, does it not strike you as a parallel with Queen Victoria? The idea of Sultana. Sultana is a very playful name. It's a non-threatening name. It doesn't threaten anybody. Sultana is sovereign. It means
It's
sovereign. Female
parallel.
sovereign. Yeah.
It's parallel, and it's an Indian reply to the Victorian Queen, that, and
Okay.
a continuum of the past as well, uh,
Hmm.
of Razia Sultana, for example, of
Interesting.
women, of what women are capable of in the
Hmm.
East, as opposed to the Queen in the West.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, so you are suggesting that Ladyland is not a Western construct.
So it may have the pale of it may have the framing of it, but the
Mm,
agency part of it, of I am the Sultana, is
mm,
in opposition to you are the queen. Like, I'm the Sultana with a new dream, and you are the queen of the old world.
mhm. But is it not the queen who rules Ladyland, and is it not the queen who's created this this new structure? And Sultana's dream does not make Sultana the sovereign of Ladyland.
Yeah, it
It only
doesn't make.
makes her the sovereign of her dream. You see my
Yeah,
point.
it is framed, of course, like I said, and
Mm,
frame tales are very interesting. Why they are framed? Um,
right.
Framing makes it something very different. If you remove the frame, and if
Mm.
it's just a story set in the future, then it has a different dimension altogether. So by framing it, it's contained itself, that this is a dream for the future, or this is a dream of women, and which is also acknowledging that women's situation is not exactly as Sultana would have liked it to be, but this is a dream.
So Amit, I suppose our trading of barbed interests regarding London and New South Wales are not going to end anytime soon, because I will keep on finding connections with London, and you will keep
So,
on finding things with
of
London
course,
via
this
New South
this is
Wales via.
very fruitful exercise, because
Yeah.
informs us all the myriad influences that were there at that time, which we take for granted and look in a very simplistic manner. But at the
Yeah.
grassroots, the situation seems to be much more interesting and complicated
Mm-hmm.
than mainstream history sees colonialism as. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of
Precisely.
interest.
In fact, you mentioned phrenology, and I'm going to teach The Hound of the Baskervilles next. And it's a novel that begins with references to phrenology, and forensic science was actually created in colonial Bengal. We do not talk about it. We don't give any credit to colonial Bengal for Sherlock Holmes. Nobody in India wants to claim Sherlock Holmes, whereas I've shown time after time after time how there's so much evidence how the cases in London were actually founded on cases from Bengal, and you are one of perhaps the only person I know in the Indian academia with whom I've been able to talk about phrenology. I think we started long time ago, if you remember, because phrenology also gets connected to eugenics very
Yeah.
easily. That connection is made. It's a very
Yeah, it's
slippery connection,
all simultaneous. Darwin, phrenology,
Yeah.
eugenics, all these ideas are of late 19th century, second half 19th century.
Exactly. So colonialism is far, far more diverse. Of course, it's not something we are celebrating. We are not in any way, guilty of complicity with the colonial regime. But it's far more diverse, and Sultana's dream is an example of that diversity. Amit, let's rejoin soon, and let's discuss more of your interests in the 19th century, and perhaps we'll get to hear about Darashiko as well in our next conversation.
Sure. It was lovely having this conversation, and I hope readers will enjoy Sultana's dream with all this background as well. And it's a text that everybody must read.
Thank you so much, Amit. Always wonderful to speak to you, and thank you for giving your very precious time. Looking forward to join you soon, and thank you, dear audience, for tuning in. Until next time.
Thanks a lot. Bye.